Welcome to the Infinite Jungle. On today's show, I'm going to be summarizing and sharing the key takeaways from All Core Developers Execution Call number 193. But before we begin the show, here is a quick show disclaimer. I need to remind you to please refer to the disclaimer linked in the podcast show notes and note that none of the information in this podcast constitutes investment advice, an offer, recommendation, or solicitation by Galaxy Digital or any of its affiliates to buy or sell any securities. On today's show, I'm going to be going over the main decisions that were made on ACDE 193. There wasn't a ton, but I'll quickly go over the key agenda items from the call, and then I will highlight probably what I thought was the most interesting part of the call, which was the discussion on the Verkle upgrade for Ethereum. Verkle is this major overhaul to Ethereum's data structure that developers have been thinking about for quite some time now. They have pre-scheduled it as the main feature of the next upgrade after Pectra. But for the first time, I think I heard quite a bit of questions around whether Verkle should be prioritized and whether or not Verkle is really the type of data structure that developers want to spend the time transitioning over to from the Merkle Patricia tree structure that Ethereum has today. So let me first quickly go over the call, and then we'll get into really what I thought was the most interesting. So very quickly, Pectra Devnet 2 was relaunched, and developers for this relaunch have agreed to not test EIP 7702 transactions on the Devnet. If you recall from the last Infinite Jungle episode that we did talking about the last ACDE call, developers, when they tried to test EIP 7702 transactions, it caused pretty major network disruptions. There was multiple forks of the Devnet that were created. And so with this relaunch, developers have agreed not to test EIP 7702 until a future Devnet. Developers are still TBD on Devnet 3, of course, because developers are figuring out the bugs of Devnet 2. They're working on the client implementations. There's still a couple of issues that they want to work through, troubleshoot, make sure that clients are in a real steady state before moving on to Devnet 3. Developers did talk about how the specifications and what types of code changes are going to be featured on Devnet 3, how things are going to change from Devnet 2 to Devnet 3, and it doesn't look like much is going to change. One really good thing, and after talking about the Devnet updates, developers moved on to talking about EIP 7702, which for months developers have been waffling on. It's been hard for them to figure out the design that everybody can agree on for EIP 7702. This is the code change that will give greater functionality to user-controlled accounts on Ethereum. It'll be able to give an EOA, an externally owned account, temporarily some smart contract functionality. And so EIP 7702, for months, developers have been kind of debating the security concerns around this EIP, and particularly trying to figure out the revocation mechanism for EIP 7702. It sounds from the latest Ethereum call that these discussions have reached a resolution and that developers are simply going to continue to move forward with the EIP 7702 design in its current state. And developers have agreed that any other changes to the EIP should be done post seeing how this EIP functions on DevNets. So developers agreed to put EIP 7702 in its latest design into Devnet 3 and really test the EIP earnestly on Devnet 3. There was some talk about potential changes to EIP 7702 when thinking about its interaction with other Pectra EIPs like the EOF code changes, which is the major overhaul to Ethereum's execution environment, the EVM. But for now, I think the wallet community, the smart contract wallet community, has agreed to, with Ethereum protocol developers, to move forward with the EIP 7702 in its current design. So that is the state of some of those Pectra code changes. A few other Pectra updates that were shared on the call. A Geth developer by the name of Felix. One note about the way that I do these calls and the way that I cover them. These calls are basically a live recording of a Zoom meeting. And so oftentimes on Zoom meetings, the full name and background of developers will not be shared. You'll just see a box or even sometimes just an image and somebody talking on these calls live. And the calls are streamed to YouTube, but very, very frequently I don't know who's actually talking. I have to do a little bit of Google searching on my own to see the background of the person. And as much as possible, as much as that information is available, I try and include them into the call notes to give some context on who's speaking. And sometimes on the calls, the developers themselves will introduce themselves, give a little bit of background on what they're working on, but that's also not infrequent. So in this case, there was a person on the Zoom call, and their screen name was Felix. And I believe Baiko introduced them as a Geth developer. But anyways, so this developer had shared another important kind of rationale for why Ethereum should eventually move to SSZ. We've talked about SSZ on this show before, but it's basically the data serialization format of the Ethereum consensus layer, and developers will eventually have to move over to SSZ because right now the serialization format of the Ethereum execution layer is different from what's on the consensus layer, and that does cause unnecessary protocol complexity when moving data from the execution layer to the consensus layer in terms of decoding that data and processing that data. And there's, of course, EIPs and other code changes that developers are considering on the consensus layer side to create the stepping stones for making that full SSC transition. And on the latest call again, this developer, Felix, noted that for EIP 6110, which is already approved for the Pectra upgrade, and what it does is it makes the validator deposit process more efficient. Instead of people that want to become a validator on Ethereum, which requires 32 ETH staked onto the network. Instead of having the network verify that the deposit for becoming a validator, that to 32 ETH staked, has been correctly staked through the deposit contract on the execution layer side, and then having the consensus layer validators vote again on those deposits, EIP 6110 basically moves the responsibility of keeping track of those deposits and relaying the information of what new deposits for validators have come in fully to the execution layer side. And what Felix pointed out was that there is a bit of decoding work that needs to happen on the execution layer side for these deposit requests. And it seems silly to him to have to decode this all into a format that the consensus layer will have to reformat anyways into SSC. And so he had mentioned, why not make a first foray into doing this SSC transition by having the deposit requests formatted in SSC instead of decoded into JSON, and in this way start to make these improvements and start to reduce the protocol complexity of Ethereum. Of course, though, this would take more work. This would take more effort by client teams. And technically for Devnet 1 and Devnet 2, on which EIP 6110 has been tested already, client teams have already implemented this EIP in such a way where they are utilizing the current data serialization format of the execution layer, RLP, and what Baiko was saying, who chairs these calls, if if you didn't know that, you're just joining in, hopping into the the conversation. Tim Biko, who chairs the calls, he had mentioned because there's so much work that still needs to be done on Pectra. EIP 7702 is not fully implemented. EOF hasn't even gotten into a DevNet. It doesn't make sense to add this additional work to change the implementation of the deposit request for EIP 6110 just yet. So he recommended that developers hold off on making those changes until the specifications for the rest of the specifications for Pectra are finalized. And one other note that I'll make on EOF, it sounds as though EOF will not actually be included in Devnet 3. It sounds as though the main change from Devnet 2 to Devnet 3 will be simply the testing of latest EIP 7702 specifications. But I think it's important, as I've said on prior calls, to keep an eye out for when EOF is added into a DevNet and when other pending code changes, like, for example, PeerDAS on the consensus layer side, is carried over to the Pectra DevNets. Because seeing all of these code changes work in tandem with one another, that is an important part of the testing process for the upgrade. Testing these code changes in isolation, of course, is important for catching bugs early on and isolating the reason for certain bugs and issues that are happening. But eventually, developers will need to mash all of these EIPs together, and testing all of the interactions between them is going to be a lot of work. There was also a update on a new API method, a new engine API method for the way that consensus layer clients fetch blob transactions from the execution layer. The method is called engine get blobs v1. From the way that developers were talking about this, it sounded like a very optional kind of new call that consensus layer clients can incorporate into their operations to make the way that they handle blob transactions more efficient. The one thing that developers had discussed was the proper way in which to utilize this new feature, this new call of the engine API, so as not to abuse the new feature in some ways. I wasn't 100% clear exactly on the technicalities of this API call, but basically developers recommended creating a new change to consensus layer specifications that detail exactly how this method should be used and in what context, under what circumstances, and for this to be brought up again on the consensus layer call next week. Today's call was more focused on the execution layer side of Ethereum protocol development. Next week, there's going to be a consensus layer and all core developers call that is focused on the consensus layer. So that was the decision made on the latest and the newest engine API method. There was some discussion on EIP 7212, which is a precompile that enables signature verification for the SECP256R1 elliptic curve. I really do not know. I've never used any of this kind of cryptography, but apparently this is a type of cryptography that a lot of modern devices use, like Apple and Android mobile phones, for signature verification. And this is a type of cryptography that would be able to unlock more use cases, better usability for users that are interacting with the Ethereum blockchain via their wallets. And this is a precompile that has already been implemented on the layer 2 rollups on Ethereum. And of course, layer 2 rollups are trying to ensure the most maximum amount of compatibility with Ethereum mainnet, and hence rollup teams have pushed and requested that this signature scheme, that this precompile also be added to the Ethereum protocol, also be added to Ethereum, the base layer. Developers, again, sort of similar to that rationale around changing the implementation of EIP 6110, developers agreed to hold off on adding anything else to the upgrade until developers are further along in the testing and the implementation process for the other EIPs. So TBD on EIP 7212, but one of the researchers on the call, one of the Ethereum Foundation researchers, Ansgar, he said that in his view, it was unlikely that developers would include more things into the upgrade, say 3-4 months from now, and I'm inclined to agree with that. I think that it is unlikely that we're going to see the upgrade increase even more, but who knows? Then developers did talk about the quantum resistance, talk about ways to becoming quantum resistant. And I'm going to put a pin in this discussion because I want to go into it a little bit in more detail with you all. So very quickly, the last two updates from the call that were shared outside of the discussion on quantum resistance was a few updates on state and history expiry. So if you think about all of the data that is currently being managed by the Ethereum blockchain, you have people that are creating new accounts every single day. And the state of Ethereum is basically the current balance of all of those accounts, the verification of every single new activity that happens on chain. It keeps record of all of the balances of the accounts. The current state of the blockchain is that's actually a horrible way to explain the state of Ethereum. I'm sure there's a better explanation, but if you think about, I guess, the current, I guess, status, maybe is another word, the status of Ethereum accounts on Ethereum, but whether they be smart contracts or user-controlled accounts, and the state of Ethereum continues to grow as more people use the blockchain, as more people create new accounts, new user-controlled, as more people start interacting with the chain. And in order to ensure that the people that are verifying all of the activity on the chain and continuing to keep the chain going, in order to ensure that their hardware doesn't have to exponentially, or I guess continuously, increase to keep up with all of the data that's being managed by Ethereum. In order to keep the people that are running the software to verify all of those rules and keep record of the state of Ethereum, there is a lot of effort to try and bound in some way or limit the growth of Ethereum state. And it's the same idea for history expiry. If you think about all of the transactions that have ever happened, so it's not the current state of an Ethereum account, but say all of the transactions that led up to what the balance is currently on Ethereum, the balance for, say, somebody's account on Ethereum. That's, of course, a lot bigger. That's a lot more data to maintain, but that data also continues to grow over time. And so there was a new EIP that was shared by two developers on the call. It's EIP 7736, and it offers a way to implement state expiry, to have, certain accounts on Ethereum that have never been interacted with, has not, done any activity over a certain period of time, say, 6 months or a year, for some way for the protocol to recognize that part of Ethereum state as inactive and make it more expensive for people to resurrect that piece of state, or in some ways to kind of lighten the load on Ethereum nodes, which are basically computers that are contributing to the verification and the operations of Ethereum. And so, I said, so this proposal is one that would work in tandem with the vertical upgrade. So with the transition over to a more efficient data structure on Ethereum, this EIP would be another addition to either to be activated along with Verkle or post Verkle to be able to implement some sort of type of state expiry. And then the other one, history expiry, that one developers have been working on for quite some time, even as they've been working on Pectra. This one is EIP 4444, and I would say that it's a lot more further along in the development and implementation process than, of course, this entirely new proposal that was shared on the latest call, EIP 4444. Developers just say 4 4s, which makes sense. So on 4 4s, one of the Ethereum Foundation DevOps engineers, Perry, had shared that he has made some updates to the way that expired history, basically parts of Ethereum history that nodes on Ethereum no longer service. So if you wanted to figure out what all the transactions in this block 10 years ago was. Actually, is Ethereum even? No, Ethereum is 9 years old as a blockchain. So I don't know, say 8 years ago. What the history was 8 years ago, you would have to request that data, request that pruned historical data that is no longer being maintained or stored by regular Ethereum nodes. You'd have to get that from a separate peer-to-peer network. You'd have to get that from either a major blockchain infrastructure company like, say, Infura, or get it through torrents. Get it through what Perry was talking about using torrents to be able to service this data in an alternative way. So there's some progress being made on both state and history expiry, but I think that these are pretty large initiatives that will take more time for developers to really flesh out and for users to be able to start seeing the impacts of this kind of work on Ethereum mainnet. So let's go back very quickly to the part of the call that I found the most interesting, which is the discussion on quantum resistance. It's so funny because every time I prepare for these shows, I always think that the summary part of what I'm talking about will be really quick. Like I'll be able to just go through all of the decisions and the updates made on the call in, say, like 5 minutes. And then I look and I'm like, oh, wow, 20 minutes have gone by. But anyways, the part of the call that I found the most interesting was raised by Andrew, who is a client developer for the Aragon client, the execution layer client Aragon. And he shared that he was listening to Vitalik Buterin's talk, Vitalik, who's the co-founder of Ethereum, his talk at ECC, which I went to and I also shared takeaways from in a prior episode. He shared that during Vitalik's talk, Vitalik was saying how quantum computers, experts are saying that quantum computers will be able to break cryptography that is widely used around the world in sooner than people expect, basically in the decade of the 2030s. And this is quite alarming because there is the Ethereum code base relies very heavily on elliptic curve cryptography, which with the advent of quantum computers would be completely broken. And it's not just really Ethereum that we're talking about that would be vulnerable in a reality where quantum computers become a thing, become working. I don't know a ton. I'm not an expert on quantum computers, but I know at a very high level that quantum computers, if they are able to solve and do these mathematical problems that our regular computers today cannot be able to solve, this would not only be a problem for just Ethereum, because the kind of cryptography that Ethereum relies on, the elliptic curve cryptography, is something that Bitcoin relies on too. And not just Bitcoin, but large swaths of the internet. So, of course, the advent of quantum computers is something that scientists and cryptographers have been working on for decades, and it is definitely a problem that when that reality comes, it's going to be a problem not just for Ethereum, but large parts of the world as we know it today, and much larger cryptocurrencies like Bitcoin. So 2030 is I suppose the number that was shared, or the date that was shared, and this of course created the concerns by Andrew, who was talking about, well, do we have a plan around this? What are we going to do? How much is this going to impact Ethereum? And should there be preparations being made today to make Ethereum quantum resistant? And while the broader implications of a quantum computer that is functional is, while many developers on the call were skeptical even of whether or not quantum computers would be ready in the 2030s, and whether the biggest problem in this reality would be Ethereum and the ability for somebody to hack Ethereum with their quantum computer. Andrew also focused the discussion on Verkle. So Verkle, as we just talked about, or as we've mentioned quite a bit on this show, is this overhaul to Ethereum's data structure. And Verkle is one of those upgrades that would not work. It would not be secure anymore for Ethereum to rely on Verkle in a reality where quantum computers exist and are functional, and say lots of people can access quantum computers. People that say have a reason to maliciously attack Ethereum, whatever that reason may be, and whoever that person may be. I don't even know how expensive quantum computers might become when they're commercialized. But anyways, this is besides the point. So honestly, I think the discussion around making Ethereum quantum resistant is, of course, interesting, but this change in the conversation to focusing on the Verkle upgrade and whether or not Verkle is something that developers want to spend their time on for the next Ethereum upgrade was quite interesting, because before this call, I was under the impression that the Verkle upgrade that developers were very confident that this was going to be the next stage of Ethereum's roadmap. And as I've shared on this call before, it's been very difficult with the Pectra upgrade because developers have been very unsure about what the priorities of Ethereum are. But when it came to post-Pectra, there was quite a bit of consensus around developers, at least before this call, on the fact that, once we figure out Pectra, depending on whatever those priorities may be, at least developers were very, very on the same page about what would happen next. And with the quantum computer threat looming in the background, there were a couple of concerns around Verkle that was also raised. The first one being, is Verkle really all that important? Verkle is meant to decrease the proof sizes of Ethereum, so being able to verify, also retrieve data on Ethereum is supposed to become a lot more efficient through Verkle, and be able to deal with the state growth of Ethereum. But as I mentioned earlier on this call, of course, the size of Ethereum's history and the history growth of Ethereum is a much larger problem. And so developers on the call were also sharing, should Verkle be the priority if state growth isn't the biggest problem of Ethereum, causing Ethereum nodes to become require more computational resources to run. And the other kind of concern around Verkle was, if it's true that quantum computers are coming in the next 2 decades, should developers really be expending all this time to make the Verkle transition if they're only going to have to transition again to a quantum resistant data structure shortly thereafter, in a few years thereafter. And to this, one of the primary people that have been working on Verkle for the last, I would say, several months, if not years, he was mentioning that all of the tools and all of the testing needed to make this change once for Verkle is something that can be reused again for another data structure transition. And he mentioned how he himself didn't believe that Verkle would really be the last last overhaul to Ethereum's data structure that there ever would be, but that it has short-term benefits that developers should focus on now. And then finally, another concern around Verkle that was shared was around other alternatives to the Verkle data structure. There appears to be some research on other types of trees, other types of data trees that developers could potentially look into. And all of this questioning around Verkle, its relative priority compared to others, whether or not it really is the best solution for Ethereum. All of this did create quite a bit of disagreement, again, on the call, contention. It felt almost like a dangerous topic to dive into that developers have been wary about really even bringing up to the surface on an all-core developers call. It seemed almost dangerous to say for a developer to express that they weren't as confident about Verkle being, the most important next step for Ethereum after Pectra. It seemed almost dangerous for developers to say that on the call, and it definitely was taken with apprehension, and there was some strong disagreement from the developers on the call that were working on Verkle and that had spent a lot of time and resources on doing this to affirm that, in their view, Verkle should be the next priority. So it's a big discussion. It's probably not going to be an important discussion, obviously, in the context of Pectra, because that is the most next immediate upgrade for Ethereum developers to focus on. But I would say over the next 6 months, this is an important area of debate and contention that developers will get into more, and it will certainly be a basis, I think, for continued discussion, but also just to continue to keep tabs on the closer developers get to being ready to talk and give more bandwidth to figuring out the next upgrade after Pectra. It doesn't seem like Verkle is the done deal just yet, which is a pretty sizable shift from, I think, what people had been thinking before this call. And very quickly, before we end off today's episode, as always, you can get the full call summary on galaxy.com. It'll be linked in the show notes as well. Very quickly, for what to expect from the next ACDE call, the next time we talk. All of these ACDE calls, they happen on Thursdays once a week. They switch between focus on execution layer and consensus layer. But for the next call on the consensus layer, we're going to see more updates on the Pectra devnets. That, of course, is important. We may also see a decision on the SSC EIPs on the consensus layer side. And similar to what we saw on today's call, I do think that there will be developers. I do think that the decision, there's a high likelihood the decision may be, let's figure out the consensus layer EIPs that we have in Pectra right now, and then, a couple months down the line, revisit the inclusion of any new EIPs. I have a feeling like that might be the way that developers move ahead with the topic of the two SSE EIPs that we had talked about on the consensus layer side on the last Infinite Jungle episode. And then finally, I'm really hoping that in the next consensus layer call, we get more information about what the PeerDAS upgrade, what data availability sampling could look like without sampling as a initial part of the PeerDAS upgrade. That was a new idea shared on the last consensus layer call that I'm hoping we get a bit more information about next week. So thank you very much for tuning in to another episode of Infinite Jungle. I hope that you learned something new about Ethereum, and I hope you enjoyed listening. I am signing off from New York, the concrete jungle. In your explorations of the infinite jungle that is Ethereum, stay safe out there.